Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Two Friends Film Podcast. My name is Brian, and I'm here with Fowler yet again. Say hello.
Hello, lovely people, and I just want to apologize that we've been delayed. Brian's been having a lot of stomach issues, and it's delayed things. Also,
Yeah,
he went on vacation. That was
yeah,
messed up of him.
that's definitely what happened. Not someone, diverting the fact that those are two things that they've been dealing with. So anyway, with that being said, um, as always, we're going to start with a summary. This time, I'm going to take over the summary since my man Fowler wants to take a break from that, which is fair. So we're talking about The Breakfast Club. The Breakfast Club was a 1985 film by John Hughes. So it stars three main characters, those being Claire, Andrew, Brian, Bender, and Allison, five students who are put in detention on a Saturday. And for some reason, they're put in detention on a Saturday for 9 hours, which I think is just probably the most absurd plot point, but we'll talk about that at some point too.
I
Um,
think it makes sense based on the themes, but we'll talk about that during themes.
yeah, it's just a weird regardless. Um, so they get put in detention. They're all three different people, with three different archetypes. Those being, Andrew's the jock, Brian's the nerd, John Bender is the delinquent, then Claire's the popular sort of girl, and Allison is kind of the oddball, weird sort of character, quirky. Um,
I would say she's the queer-coded artist. I think
yeah,
that's probably the way to frame it.
Yeah, I mean, like in terms of the vibe they were giving off, in terms of it, like they they even described her at the end of the film as like the oddball. But regardless, um, and then you have Richard, who's like the educator. It's never specified, I don't think, if he's like a principal or a teacher, but he's the one in charge of the detention, and he's basically like just loosely monitoring these kids while fucking off and doing his own bullshit. And then
I don't think that I think he has to be a teacher because he doesn't he brag at a point in the movie that he's making like 25 grand. I'd hope that even in the 90s, teachers get or principals get paid better than that.
it was 85. I feel like the weird thing is he probably still could have afforded a house and a place to live, which, the times they are changing, of course. But and then we had Carl, and I think Carl is one of the more interesting characters.
We'll
He
talk
was,
about that in the characters, but yeah,
of
he's the
course,
janitor and
he
very interesting.
yeah, an interesting dynamic there. But yeah, so those are our main seven leads. That's all we have throughout the film. I mean, you have the sprinkling of the parents coming and going when they pick up their kids and drop them off, but that's kind of, they're very, very small in this film. But anyway, this film takes place over this entire detention period where the kids kind of grow and learn about each other and about how, even though they're very different, they still have a lot of similar issues in terms of their home life and many different facets of that going on. And it's explored throughout the film in dialogue heavy sort of teen drama, right? So,
I would also add that the children come together and overcome their stereotypes they have about themselves. But this is also a film that's really a rebellion.
mhm,
The children ultimately work together to thwart Richard, and he asks them during the detention to write a personal essay, um, essentially apologizing for what they've done. And instead of turning in five separate essays, they turn in a single essay where they tell him to go fuck himself.
yeah.
So yeah, that's a
And
different part.
I want to point out too, under 1,000 words. So they kind of broke the rule twice there, with turning in one essay and under 1,000. But yeah, that's the basic gist of it. I don't think there's like it's a very basic, straightforward plot, but with a lot of nuance and a lot of interesting details interspliced.
Yeah, I would say the wrinkles. The story itself is quite conventional, but the wrinkles, the things that make it interesting, are the characters and how they're explored. Um,
Yeah,
really,
yeah.
because this is
So
almost entirely a character-driven
yeah, exactly.
plot.
I was gonna say, let's talk about the strengths and the weaknesses a little bit before we move
Okay,
into theme work. So
our characters.
or characters as well. Uh,
Yeah,
so realistically, I want to talk about some of the things that the film does really well. So the dialogue for this film is hyper realistic. It for me it captures that perfect element of like teenage angst and like just like not really like feeling like basically high schoolers where they feel like they know what they're talking about but they really don't, and that like overconfidence mixed with that awkwardness is something that's showcased throughout the entirety of the film in terms of its writing. I mean, uh,
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would
yeah.
say my only complaint would be because it's a very interesting film because they really each of the five students in particular and Richard the teacher, they really have like different slang, and the way they structure their sentences and communicate is very different.
Mm,
But I would say it's a little unbalanced. Like I found Allison, who's like the arty one, and Bender, the delinquent. I thought they were much cruder, not as realistic. But like, I think overall it was really well done, and they did a great job in the dialogue distinguishing between the different characters. Because some very well written films, everyone sounds the same. I mean, I have this critique about Christopher Nolan. Like, not only does Christopher Nolan's characters they never talk like human beings, they all talk in the same weird, like quasi philosophical way.
mm.
This film doesn't do that.
Yeah, and I feel like it's one of those things where I think the writing matches up with the characters in a really interesting and beautiful way. And I will say with Bender and Allison, I tend to disagree because I feel like I've met people in that vein, right? Like where it's not necessarily that they are talking in a way that I think is not within character. I think they just like you'll see for me here's the example. I think with Allison you see her literally not talk for most of the film and then start to open up later on and open about her sort of shit going on, and I think that's pretty accurate to like a character archetype there, you know.
I would say Bender and Allison are really well constructed as characters, but it's kind of the dialogue specifically. What would you say out of the kids? Who do you think is the kid that's best written, and what do you think is the kid who's worst written, in your opinion, in terms of realism?
In terms of realism, um god, probably Andrew. I would
Best or worst?
I would say Andrew is probably the best.
Yeah, I agree.
Claire is probably the worst written.
Interesting.
Yeah, no, we'll talk about that if you want to dive into that more. I would say, uh, I would go, okay, from ranking best to worst, I would go Andrew, Bender, Brian, Allison, Claire.
I would go Andrew, Brian, Claire, Allison, Bender. I think that's my order. And also, I think the best written character is actually Richard the teacher. I think they really nail like the way teachers talk privately and publicly, and the terminology they use.
Really, because I've never really seen that. Like, I guess maybe I've never really seen the private moment of a teacher being like in that frustrated sort of position. But I don't know. Like, I think for me, like actually the one who I think is one of the better written characters is Carl. Like in terms
Oh
of
yeah, Carl is a fascinating character. Although I would argue he's the most fantastical out of all the characters. There's a lot of elements of Carl that are super interesting and unique, and I think he and Richard are very interesting. They're almost like paths the children can take later in life in the way that they approach the world.
yeah. And then I would also the other strength I was going to talk about was like character development. Like you see it throughout the entirety of this small piece. It's not even a long film, you know. And that's another thing I wrote about. Like it's a film that doesn't really have points where it drags, you know. It feels like
Oh yeah, it's well paced.
it's well paced. It's like very like boom, boom, boom. Here's the action. Here's the characters. Let's introduce it as quickly as possible without overwhelming our audience because it's not a huge ensemble cast, right?
Yeah, and it's a difficult film, I think, because like you have to have a couple revelations for each of the characters, and they're in a dynamic, they're in a group, they're not really going off by themselves, and you have to layer those reveals on top of each other. And I think something the film also did really well is the character development feels realistic to me.
mhm.
Like the way the children help each other, like it's breaking their stereotypes in some ways, but it's also helping people the way they know how to be helped. And particularly with Bender and Brian, I think they have they have like relapses almost, where they kind of at different points in the film actually regress and go back to being who they were at the beginning. And I thought that was like really well layered and very realistic.
Well, and I think that's the thing, like about character development, right? It's not a smooth, like upward trajectory, right? There are bumps and valleys to that sort of life path, right? And I think that's what distinguishes me from good writing to great writing is that ability to understand that innate part of the human condition, you know?
I would
Um,
agree. I would say the writing's really good, the character development is good. The thing that really blew me away is the acting, especially since like the kids are like actually pretty young. And
y-
like I really think there's no weak performances. I think all the kids like they really nailed their characters. And that's hard because a lot of this film is about stereotyping of others and yourselves. And you have to have those contradictions throughout the film that become more and more obvious and self-aware. And I thought they did a really, really excellent job. The only character who doesn't go through a character arc is Carl, and we'll explain that later.
yeah, and I
Um,
I think for me, what's really interesting is like everyone here is a very young actor, right? This is like them starting off their career acting wise. Um, they like from the limited amount of research I did after the film, I saw that most of them this was like maybe their couple forte into acting, especially with the five main high school kids, right? Um,
I didn't know that.
yeah, so like, but so most of these actors were part of the Brat Pack, which you know about, right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so that was kind of that era of it, but a lot of them like this was kind of their first go-to or first major go-to. But
Mm.
so in terms of like weaknesses, there aren't many on my end. I don't have a lot of critiques. What I will say is it's not a technically complex film, right? Like technique wise, camera wise, there's not a lot going on, but I don't necessarily think that is a huge hindrance because I don't think it's necessary for a film like this. Like with a bottle film like this,
Mm.
I don't think you need that as much. Like you don't need those
I,
dynamic moments.
I would agree. And the other thing I would say is the dialogue is very good in Breakfast Club, but a lot of the Breakfast Club is in particular it's facial expressions and body language. And so these kind of more basic shots where you see the entire group, I think they're really necessary to read the dynamics. I think one of the actors who does a really good job on this is the actor who plays Bender.
Mhm.
Bender is like a very, very interesting role, and because of who Bender is as a human being, he often doesn't express himself in honest ways. And so, like, his performance is almost entirely um, facial expressions and body language, you know? And I
Yeah,
think more complicated camera work might hurt that because it's, you know, you need to see his reactions and how they start and then how they blow up and then how it settles
yeah,
slowly.
yeah, and like that's the thing with like a movie that takes place in primarily one setting is that you want to focus on your characters more than you want to focus on the world as a whole because there's not much of the world as a whole, right? You know what I mean?
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
another thing I put down is that I felt like the romances were really forced. Like I felt like it was not like it was like a built upon thing, but especially when it came to Andrew and Allison, I didn't see that as much. I saw like like how did you feel about the like sort of romantic dynamics between like the two couplings that happened?
Yeah, so the romantic couplings is Claire, the popular girl, and Bender, the delinquent, and
Mm,
Andrew, the jock, and Allison, the artist. I feel mixed. I think they were kind of put out at the end, and it felt a little forced. I'd agree with you,
mm,
and I don't think necessarily you need to be romantic with people that like affect you in really powerful ways.
yeah.
But this is a coming of age story about horny teenagers. So I think the idea that you have this massive connection with this person in a way that you've never felt intimacy before, I do think that this story usually ends with everyone hooking up, you know. So I think there's a realism to that. And this is teenage love. This isn't like more mature love. So those relationships, I think, by definition, are often going to be much more simple, much more instinctual, and much more sort of almost spontaneous.
Yeah, so I guess that was primarily the strengths and weaknesses I was thinking on. Is there anything that comes to your mind in terms of like that? Or
I would say the one weakness, and I don't mind it, is this film is very aged. The slang, because this film uses it heavily, it's all, no, there's like two generations of people who've not used that slang.
mm,
And I don't think the stereotypes are really accurate anymore, or their power dynamics. But I don't think it matters because this is really, I think, a film that's not really about the stereotypes specific to the story. It's about stereotypes as a whole. So I don't mind it.
yeah, so I guess that leads us into, I guess, talking mainly about the characters, because I know you really want to delve into that. So, who would you want to start with first in terms of like talking about? Would you want to start with Carl? Because we've talked about him a little bit.
Let's do Carl and Richard last.
Okay.
And we can do, I think what we should do is we should start with the characters who are most affected by authority and most conformed by it. And then we should end with the characters that are least affected by it.
Interesting. Why do you want to go ranking based on conformity to like talk about the characters? I'm just curious.
Because I think there are three things about each character that really matter. One
Mm,
is their relationship to authority. One is the stereotypes they have about themselves and others, and um, the advantages and disadvantages of who they became. Oh, and also what they did to rebel at the end of the film. So
yeah.
I just want to go through in that sequence. Um, yeah.
Okay.
So
S-
so Claire is she's the popular girl. Her self-esteem is tied to likability, and that likability is tied to things like being wealthy. She has expensive makeup, diamond earrings, being cultured. She eats sushi for lunch on a Saturday. She reads classical literature. She vacations in Europe, and being popular, going to all the prep kid parties. Um, Claire's relationship with authority, which is shown through her parents and then demonstrated how she deals with the teacher Richard, is that her wealthy parents don't care about her and they give her luxuries as a way of getting back at each other. They don't really care about her as a person. So for her, like authority is something that weaponizes her. And she perceives authority as something that she manipulates in order to gain things for herself. And the way she views the detention is it's something she can negotiate her way out of. Claire is the only character in the film who attempts to negotiate with and read Richard and get out of detention.
mm,
And, these things give Claire people she's more empathetic to and less empathetic. Um, Claire is Claire views popularity as the only thing that matters because that's the way she controls the world. And so she denigrates Bender, Brian, and Allison as failures who, would abandon all of their actual values and skills if they could be like her. She has kind of a superiority complex. I think Claire is actually the hardest character to empathize with out of the children. Um, and yeah, she views the others as inferior to her, basically. And Claire's also a wasp. So she's disgusted by drug use, sex, mental illness, trauma, non atomic family relationships. where Claire is empathetic and the way Claire tries to help people is all about social optics. She protects Brian, the nerd, when he's attempting to mask his virginity because social optics is the currency of the world she lives in. And so it's something that she can relate to him about. And Claire helps Allison at the end of the film by doing her makeup and dressing her up nicely, which is also about optics, helping people dress in ways that allow them to be perceived in the way they want to be perceived. Having that manipulative style means that she's really adept at manipulation. You could argue it's particularly powerful with adults. She's someone who can, use her father to bail her out of the consequences of her actions. She can bend the rules so they don't apply to her like other people. And of course, negotiating with the teacher. The disadvantages, because her relationships are so reliant on her appearance and presentation, she's terrified of being emotionally vulnerable, having sex, being perceived as unattractive. And that means that not only can she not rely on her actual friends, but she's the most afraid to emotionally connect with other children. And she's the most afraid of being friends with them in public after detention. Claire is the most dependent on those authority figures. She manipulates them, but she needs them. She doesn't have a lot of autonomy. She needs those adults to handle her problems because she's incapable of it. And she's the one in the Breakfast Club who's easiest to be peer pressured into doing things because her power is so strong in some ways, but also so reliant on other people. And it's also why she gets confused by personal values, like how Bender, out of principle, fights Richard the teacher, because in her world, it's all manipulation and practicality. And her arrogance and narcissism means she has a lot of trouble connecting with the other children. And her act of rebellion is she enters a relationship with Bender, and she gives him one of her earrings, despite him being the most socially unpalatable member of the Breakfast Club. And I don't know if you have any thoughts before I move to Andrew.
No, I think you really hit the nail on the head there. I will say, like, with Claire, I think there's this level of, like, you listing her as the most conforming makes the most sense to me, because it seems like socially, she just realizes that her status is the most important thing to her, because outside of that, she doesn't really have much going on, right?
Yeah, exactly. And all the children are like that. They rely on very specific strategies to maintain their self-esteem and to deal with authority. So Andrew, I would say, is the second most conforming. His stereotype is that he's the athlete. Winning wrestling tournaments is what determines his worth as a person. And it's only by continuing to win that he's valued and that he can respect himself. He does this by being toxically masculine. He does it by having an unquestioning soldier mentality about everything he does, being extremely goal-oriented, and having absolutely no tolerance for failure or weakness within himself. His relationship with his parents and his authority is that his competitive coach father doesn't give a shit about him. And he just wants to mold him into basically the strongest athlete possible. He's not a winner because he wants to be. It's because he's been created that way, like a trained dog or like a racehorse. So for him, authority controls his goals, it controls his life, controls his eating habits, controls everything. And he views detention in a very goal-oriented way. Like, he's the one that really wants to complete it successfully because for him, it's an obstacle to him succeeding at the wrestling competition he wants to do in the next couple of days. Andrew has empathy for some people and stares and kind of non-empathy for other people. He doesn't have any empathy for people who aren't in his mind winners, who aren't goal-oriented and don't really face their mettle and compete with others. So he doesn't value Bender the delinquent, Allison the artist, or Brian the nerd. Andrew, I would say, is probably the most moral person out of the kids. He has a really strongly defined sense of right and wrong, and he goes out of his way to protect some of the other children. But that honor is Andrew protects are women. He protects Allison and he protects um, Claire. He doesn't particularly protect Brian. And, you know, his the results are only the only thing that matter, means that he views a lot of these sort of underlying reasons for things as lies to garner sympathy and sort of explain their failures. He thinks that both Allison and Bender's stories about childhood abuse, that they're lies. He doesn't really believe in mental health at the beginning of the film. And he's antagonistic to the idea that they're complaining about their families, even if their families have done horrifying things to them, because it's a sign of disloyalty, because he's so individualistically focused, I suppose. But there are people he empathizes with. He empathizes with Brian because of his loyalty and commitment to his family, which is something Andrew respects. He's empathetic to, women, as we said, and other prep kids. He's antagonistic to people he perceives as bullies. And he actually attacks and beats up Bender during the film for being a misogynistic pig. And even the way he relates to the child he bullied, which is why he's in detention, the reason that he feels for that child mainly is because he imagines how ashamed that kid would be when he would explain, being bullied by his father, that affecting his sense of masculinity and pride and being perceived as a loser, which is the thing that Andrew's most terrified of. Andrew's life gives him advantages and disadvantages. He has a massive amount of natural strength and leadership and presence. He's the one that can get the children to get together and do things. He's the one who can speak his mind. And it's when Andrew decides he wants things in the Breakfast Club dynamic, he gets them more than anyone else. And that rigid honor code means he has loyalty from a lot of people because he helps them out. But there are disadvantages. His obsession with strength means that he's homophobic. He's unwilling to admit weakness or difficulties. He's the last member of the Breakfast Club to really open up, because his life is so controlled and he doesn't choose goals for himself. He's not very independently minded. He can't really think for himself, and he doesn't question the why of things. When he takes charge, when the children leave the library and they need to get back before Richard notices, he leads them into a dead end. He has all the natural talents of a leader, but he doesn't think like one. He doesn't perceive himself as one. And having everything in his life controlled means he doesn't really have a lot of personal ambition. And of course, like, his might is right idea means he's the one who's most willing to violence with the other children, the other male children, even Brian. And then the way that he rebels is he uses his leadership in order to normalize talking about the unsatisfying home lives and discussing mental health. He's really the first person to learn from the other children. When Bender talks about his abusive childhood, Andrew ridicules him and claims that those are lies in order to make people feel sorry for him. When Allison talks about her trauma, he pulls her away privately instead of deriding her publicly like Bender. Yeah, he's empathetic. And not only does he not question whether those things are real, he tells her deliberately that she doesn't have to give him details to make him uncomfortable. And then at the end, he dates Allison, who isn't obsessed with being strong or winning or anything. She's kind of a free spirit who does what she wants. And yeah. Do you have thoughts before we move to Brian?
Yeah, no, again, I feel like that's pretty apt. I think what I'm starting to see from this character sort of ordering of the conformity too, it's interesting to me how the two most conforming characters ended up with the two least conforming characters of our main sort of students, yeah?
Yeah, it's a deliberate choice, I think.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. But
I
yeah.
think Brian being in the middle and not getting of anyone at the end, I think that's very interesting.
Okay. Yeah, definitely talk about Brian here for a sec. For sure.
So I will admit, out of all the children, the two I dislike the most. I'm not a big fan of Bender, but I hate Brian. It's very hard for me to empathize with Brian. He's the worst for like 2/3 of the film, in my opinion. Um, so Brian's the smarty pants kid. His grades are what determines his self esteem and also worth. And he's the one that can't survive the most, breaking from a stereotype. Um, Brian cares so much about his academic excellence, he considers killing himself when his GPA will be lowered to the point it is no longer an A, and it's like a B plus. Brian's relationship with his parents and authority is that he needs to be the best academically, and there's enormous pressure for him to be the best in that way. And for him, authority is transactional. He, he's not controlled in the same way that Andrew is, but he's expected through whatever means to achieve those grades and do well in school if he wants to be loved or respected or accepted. And his parents don't care about like his behavior changing when he goes to detention. They just want him to like study during the time period and not waste it. They're also results oriented. And he views the detention as just another task. And it's not like Andrew, who just wants to finish it as quickly as possible to move on to his next goal. Brian wants to do the best at detention. He wants to complete it as perfectly as possible. Brian's empathy and lack of empathy. Brian is wildly classist. he views trade skills as like absolutely useless. He destroys his GPA because he takes shop because he thinks that like any idiot can do it, and then he fails the class. He's not empathetic about poverty, drug use, childhood trauma. Out of all these 5 characters, the one who gets guillotined during the French Revolution is 1,000% Brian, even though Andrew and Claire have way more money than him. Brian is empathetic to male students who he wants approval from. Because when he's dropped off, maybe he has a dad, but the only people in the car are his sisters and his mother, and he attempts to gain their approval and copy them. The advantages. Brian is the most honest member of the group, and the only one that the other children don't view with suspicion. Now, I don't know if this is necessarily because he's a good person. I think it's that he's very, very autistic and he really can't help himself. But the other thing is, Brian is the most empathetic member of the Breakfast Club. He's the only one who's kind and respectful to the janitor Carl, and the only one who knows his name. His disadvantages. Brian's lack of social skills means that he often accidentally hurts all the other children more than literally anyone else. It's unbelievable. He's racist. He's ableist. He shits all over the things they believe and think about.
To be fair, Brian. So, for those of you who I don't think I've talked about this on the podcast, but I have a little bit of the autism as well. I was diagnosed very young. So when we were watching this film together, I want to point out that Fowler was just like, oh, he's doing a looks like Brian's having another little autism moment, and then he would just like look at me while we were talking about it, and I was like, dude, come on. Listen, I'm not that bad, okay?
Depends on the time, I think.
Okay.
And this sort of autism, it makes it, he's the one who has the most difficulty forming relationships with others. He has no control of the way he presents. He constantly brings up details that are unnecessary that embarrass him, or he overcompensates. At a certain point in the film, he pretends to be this drug-taking sex machine cast of a figure, and just totally humiliates. Um, he's the last one to really change, I think. I don't know if it's because he's the most close-minded. I think it's that he just doesn't read the underlying meaning and implications of what the other children say. He's kind of in the dark for most of the film, actually. And then being so process oriented means that he's the only member of the kids who doesn't realize that the essay assignment and detention itself is pointless and useless and unfair. He's the only one who thinks that like completing it matters. And then Brian is so rule-oriented that he's deeply uncreative and he's completely useless for anything outside of academics. Brian is his act of rebellion, he's the first member of the children to say openly that they're friends with him. And in the end, he is the one who writes the final essay for the rest of the group, who are not as skilled at writing as he is, and to sort of eloquently summarize the thoughts and feelings of others. Any thoughts before we move to Bender?
I think Brian gets a bad rap. That's all I'm gonna say.
We'll do a second part of this. It's just going to be 3 hours of you defending Brian as I bring up all the insane things that he accidentally said to these children. Okay, so Bender. Bender is interesting because on the surface he's the most unconforming of the children. But it's actually not true. Bender massively conforms to authority. It's just that instead of embracing authority like the others, he rejects it. But like he's completely controlled in the same way. Bender's the delinquent. His self-esteem is all about giving the finger to the man. His abusive parents don't care about him, and they use him as an outlet for their frustration and poverty. So for him, authority hurts him, and he responds by fighting it and attempting to attack it and destroy it in any way he can. Bender, I would say that Bender is the most bitter, and he's also the most close-minded and hateful of the children. Bender hates wealthy people, which in his mind is really everyone besides himself, and not deserving of empathy. Bender is sexist and also tied to his insecurities of poverty. He claims that women only care about money and status items, which conveniently are the things he doesn't have when he can't get these women. And then Bender just has he's racist, he's classist, he's ableist, just a real baller. He has all of the prejudices. Bender hates Brian in particular and bullies him the most aggressively throughout the film because Brian's parents are the most openly supportive and loving, and Bender resents him. An enormous amount of Bender's pathology is resenting people who have things that he feels he doesn't. And Bender views his suffering through most of the film, really until the very end, as basically being the only legitimate form of suffering, and he's pretty uninterested in caring about people he perceives as more privileged, what they're suffering with. But Bender does have his empathetic moments. Bender empathizes with Claire about her parents' divorce because of his own parents' violent, unstable relationship. Bender cares about mental illness. He's the only child to hide how funny how funny he thinks Brian's suicide attempt is, where he attempted to kill himself with a flare gun. I can't think of a less efficient, more painful way to die than slowly burning through your skull with a flare gun. Yeah. And Bender respects people who hold their ground. Bender shit talks Carl the janitor, and then Carl the janitor just shits all over him and wins the argument, and Bender walks away from that being impressed and respecting him more. Bender has the most advantages and disadvantages. Bender's loyalty takes the fall for them, and is punished for things they all did.
You cut out there for a second. You were saying he's loyal?
Yeah, he's loyal to his friends. Mm-hmm. And when he befriends the Breakfast Club, he is the fall guy. He takes the responsibility and punishment that the rest of them should. Bender's very generous, but mainly about physical things. He gives his glasses to Andrew. He shares all of his drugs with the rest of the children. Bender's very street smart. He knows how to booby trap his locker. He knows how to navigate the school without being caught by Richard the teacher, and he escapes being locked in a storeroom through the ceiling ventilation. Bender's very blunt, too, but he's the one who's willing to bring up very difficult, frank conversations about trauma and abuse, and he's necessary for the Breakfast Club to open up. And but and Bender really kicks the story off. His hatred of authority, which is greater than any other child, means that he's the original instigator and rebel, and he's the one that pushes the other children to rebel. Um, and he does a lot of things that are necessary logistically. He's the one that unscrews the library door so that it can't be opened and held open, so that they can talk in privacy. Um, which the plot doesn't happen if Bender doesn't do that. Bender's most formidable weapon, though, is that he's incredibly eloquent and vicious verbally. Bender weaponizes his lack of innocence so that he can leverage his kind of willingness to talk about filth, his sexual experience, and his drug use to gain kind of a psychological advantage over the other children. Bender also weaponizes being good at reading people, being abused himself, and his kind of charisma to verbally attack the other children and target their weak spots, calling Andrew gay, calling Claire fat and a virgin, which gives him temporary interpersonal power. But Bender has an enormous amount of weaknesses because he's the most traumatized and hate-filled member of the Breakfast Club. Bender rejects people who reject him, or before they reject him, which means he destroys a lot of relationships. And even though he brings the group together, he's very much the odd man out at the end of the film. He can't control himself because, he'd rather be hated than fail at being loved. And this is particularly true when the children are sharing their emotions and he mocks Claire for something she reveals in confidence. He can only create chaos. He can't build unity. Bender's prejudices mean that he has no problem bullying, hurting, or stealing from the other children. He takes Brian's chair. He takes Brian's lunch. Bender's trauma and drug use means that he's wildly unstable and self-destructive. A lot of the actions he does in the film are pointlessly chaotic. Lighting a shoe on fire, stealing things that he doesn't need, being openly disrespectful to the teacher so that he gets like 7 detentions, ripping apart books and then leaving all the pieces all over the library. When he talks about his childhood going into a rage and like just ransacking the second floor of the library. Bender pretends to be a tough guy, but he's kind of an enormous coward. When he loses arguments with Richard and Andrew, he takes it out on Brian and Allison who can't defend themselves. And, he's not actually good at fighting. Andrew just bodies his ass. And then also, he allows Richard, he'll insult Richard, but he allows Richard to basically, steal from him, threaten him, abuse him, disrespect him. It's all kind of a performance for Bender. And Bender, it's not just that he's self-destructive in the way he rejects authority. He also rejects actually useful skills that would make him more independent, like social skills, academic success, being goal-oriented. Bender constantly wants attention. He sings, he throws things at the other children, he threatens to impregnate a child, he taunts people. And it's because he's desperate for attention, and it's such an easy way to control him as a person. But without Bender, the Breakfast Club wouldn't have come together at the beginning. So he's kind of mainly important at the beginning of the story.
Well, he's the catalyst to the entire. You always have that character who is a catalyst to the events. Sometimes it's your protagonist, sometimes it's, and I guess all these kids function as a protagonist in their own right?
But yeah. I would say the beginning of the film, Bender is like the giant of the 5 children. And then as the film continues, he recedes and the other children more take charge.
Yeah, I can see that.
Okay, Allison. The themes will be much faster. It's just that the characterizations are everything in this film.
Yeah.
Allison is the artist. Being unique is what determines her self-esteem. And her relationship with authority. Her parents are neglectful. They don't give a shit about her. They ignore her because she's not useful to them. So for her, authority just is apathetic. And she lives her life outside of it, regardless of what other people think how she wants. Allison is interesting because she's the one who is least prejudiced because she's outside of the stereotypes of other people and she doesn't care about the way she's perceived. She's the most self-aware of the children. In terms of advantages, Allison customizes everything about her, most shown by the weird fucking ass sandwich that she makes. Because all the other children either don't have lunch or their parents made them lunch. And that means that like she's incredibly happy and independently minded, free spirited compared to the others, because the respect of authority figures doesn't matter to her, or the authority figures hating her doesn't matter to her. She's the least controlled and controllable. Um, and this helps her in a lot of ways. She's a compulsive liar for attention, and she claims to be like a victim of molestation, a kleptomaniac, and an alcoholic to like achieve short-term interpersonal goals and throw off the other children. She's very inventive and resourceful in disgusting ways. She uses dandruff to help create like a winter drawing she's making. She's the most aware of other children's stereotypes and how it limits them. Like, she's the one that understands that the reason Claire is so cagey about her sex life is because if she has a lot of sex, she comes off as a slut and it damages her image. But if she says she's a virgin, then it makes her look like a prude. And she's in an impossible position because of her stereotype. And she has a massive imagination, which allows her to kind of escape reality. The disadvantages: she has no friendships, and she has no social control, and she has the least influence over the other children. She publicly chews her nails, she gargles her soda, she self-harms pretty openly at the beginning of the film. She doesn't have any hygiene. And she's the one who really has to initiate information about herself. The others are asked about it at some point. Allison, because she runs her own life so independently, many of the ways that her life runs are self-destructive. She eats a lot of unhealthy food, she self-harms, and like Bender, Allison is addicted to attention and will do anything to gain it temporarily, regardless of the long-term consequences. And at the end of the film, she gets Andrew, a man who's the embodiment of conforming and who she initially doesn't respect. And she allows Claire to change her appearance in a more socially acceptable way to relate to others. Do you have any thoughts before we do Richard?
No, I would say we're good to move on to Richard for sure.
Richard and Carl are examples of how you can weaponize stereotypes in different ways. So Richard is kind of this condescending, smug teacher. And one of the things about Richard is that he's wildly incompetent. He doesn't even bother staying in the class that detention is happening. He can't open or close the door competently, even though it's literally a single fucking nail. He takes no responsibility for any of his failures and blames other people like Andrew and Bender. He takes a shit and leaves toilet paper hanging off his fucking ass. He's fooled regularly by even the dumbest children, like Brian. And it's his stupidity that means that the children realize not to take authority so seriously. And he also talks in cliches. He's so cliched in what he says that Bender can mouth them before he says them. But that's why Richard cares so much about the stereotype of the stern teacher. Is he's a pathetic, insecure, wildly incompetent human being. His stereotype as an authority figure is the only thing that makes him powerful. He's obsessed with his self-appearance. He checks himself in the mirror all the time. He's obsessed with the way students perceive him. A lot of his brutality to Bender is that Bender's the one that makes him look like an idiot. And his appearance is the thing that matters to him, maintaining the stereotype. And he's not able to gain genuine respect as a person. He relies on those stereotypes to survive, essentially. And he does this not only by reinforcing his stereotypes, but by brutalizing people and his authority in abusive ways. Like the 9-hour detention where people can't walk, talk, or move. Absolutely unhinged, but it's a way of him maintaining control. he claims punishing the students is a good act for society. He gives people detentions out of spite, not because they've actually done things wrong. He's callous. He looks through the confidential files of the children in order to hurt them. He blames the children for everything and views them as their stereotypes. He openly says that he's given up on Bender. He's going to die in jail. He doesn't care about their feelings. He claims they're, polluted and kind of cursed children. He threatens to hurt Bender. He locks Bender in a supply closet without any food and water. He threatens to beat up Bender in private. He, and he weaponizes these things. He weaponizes the stereotypes. He attacks Bender specifically because he knows Bender's a delinquent and nobody believes him because he lies all the time. And so he can hurt him with impunity without anyone catching on. Carl is almost the reverse. If Richard relies on being tied to his stereotype to survive, Carl weaponizes the fact that he's not his stereotype of like the dumb janitor. And he uses his stereotype to remain undetected and do his own interests. Carl is perceived by everyone in the film as this dumb, statusless loser, and he knows it. And he uses that stereotype to blend in and be unnoticed. He also doesn't allow those stereotypes to blind him to who the people he's dealing with are. He's the most perceptive of who Richard is and why he acts the way he does. And he doesn't care about authority. He perceives Richard as his inferior, despite the fact Richard is pretty much in every way on paper the person who really should be giving orders. Carl is a sinister character in some ways. He spies on the students, he goes through their letters and lockers, and he also blackmails Richard kind of at the end of the story because he's tracking all of the kind of criminal things Richard does throughout the film and uses it to extract money from him. He's an example of living within your stereotype in order to be socially acceptable while not allowing it to actually control the way you perceive yourself or live your life. So yeah, I would say those are the characters. I don't know if you had any thoughts about Richard and Carl.
Yeah, I mean, Carl to me is, like you said, breaking that sort of stereotype. I will say, like, I've never really encountered a teacher of that authoritarian, like, mindset. Maybe I've just had a better time at school than you've had in terms of growing up and dealing with authority figures. But I've never really seen that. So that one seemed more farcical to me than even Carl's portrayal.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's definitely a less common thing, but I mean, teachers have historically been wildly abusive pieces of shit, and a lot of them resent the fact that they get those gigs because they're low status, low paying jobs because they're not cut out to like be actual experts in the field they're teaching or be professors.
Yeah. I guess then we can move into themes. And do you think this is gonna go pretty quick, or do you have a
I
lot
think
to
so.
talk about? Yeah. Okay. So you can just go ahead, give us what you have, and then I'll chime in if I have any other thoughts there.
So the big theme of the film is stereotypes and how damaging they are. The stereotypes stop the children from connecting with other people who are different from them. They stop the children from learning about the world outside their bubbles. They stop them from growing as people. Like in the end of the film, when the different kids help each other with the things they know and those children don't. And the children aren't unified. Their stereotypes break them up. So they're not able to come together in any meaningful way. But it also hurts them on in a personal level. They think universal experiences of growing up are unique to them. And they have to live with that loneliness. And they're miserable. They're traumatized, they're anxious, they're depressed to the point with Brian of literally wanting to off themselves. It's a film that really shows how ugly stereotypes can be and how damaging they can be to people. And I think the other thing about it is like all of the stereotypes that children have about themselves and the world were given to them by their authority figures, their teachers and their parents. They're not prejudiced because they're born with it, they're prejudiced by their environments.
Mm.
And I think that's why it's so important that throughout the film, a lot of the ways the children link, like the things that hurt the children and make them hurt each other, are their environmental conditions. But the way the children connect outside of really emotionally connecting at the middle, beginning part of the film is just like doing child shit that's universal. They whistle children's cartoons together, they dance, they tell jokes, they play games. Um, yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like stereotypes wise, and we talked about this earlier with the film dating itself because of this, but I feel like, I mean, they tend to kind of stay within their lanes, right? Like their worldviews are changed by encountering, the other kids with it, but I feel like it's still one of those films where there's not as much of a, compared to modern day sort of stereotyping, there's not as much fluidity, I guess. And I always wondered, is that like indicative of the 80s, or is that indicative of people, much older people, writing these films about kids in the 80s?
I mean, I don't know enough about the 80s, but what I would say is like stereotypes are massively historically or culturally dependent, right? Like there are thousands of different variants of stereotypes across this country, depending on your status economically, your race, your religion.
Mm.
So I don't think there's any film that the stereotypes will be universal, and I think they did a smart decision by not attempting to do that. They picked out a very specific era that they felt they knew, and then they attempted to have more general lessons about stereotyping in general that expanded beyond that. And I think they succeeded.
Yeah, I could see that. You also talked about like authoritarianism. Are you talking about it from a political perspective on this film's front, or are you talking about it from just the authority things we've already discussed at this point?
Well, I think one of the things the film does really, really well, I think, is the dynamic between authority and rebellion in society, politically, but also culturally and socially. I think the film does a great job of showing how authoritarians operate and how they maintain power. Um, like the authority figures in this film are almost predatory. Richard uses the children to make himself powerful. The parents weaponize their children or control their children or hurt their children in order to sort of satiate their own desires. And, in return, the children have to sacrifice their freedom, their autonomy, um, and their healthiness. So it shows how authoritarianism is so one-sided. And I think it shows a lot of the strategies that authoritarians use to actually control society. This isn't just a political thing, it's also a religious thing and a cultural thing. The stereotypes help those authority figures maintain power. The reason the parents have such a stranglehold on the kids is because they've created a world of stereotypes that make the children not trust each other. So the only way each child knows about the world is through what their parents have dictated to them. They're isolated. They can't unify and come together, and they can't leave the bubble that they exist in order to objectively evaluate what's in that bubble. And it's a strategy of compartmentalizing everything so that you can have the maximum amount of control. And that's a historical thing that lots of groups of people have done. Political machines, ethnic ones, the Jewish Italians and Irish did this. They made, and also like really any ethnic group that's a minority, you make your people terrified of the outside world and think that they can't survive without you and they shouldn't leave their neighborhoods. And then you just run the neighborhoods and you run everything.
Yeah.
That's what gangs do. That's what cults do. And that's how authoritarians operate. I think this movie did an excellent job of showing that, how they weaponize stereotypes and fear in
And I
order to
guess
achieve their goals.
and I guess in this case how people rebel against authoritarians, right?
Yeah, you want to move to that theme? That's the last theme for me. I don't know if you had any others.
Um, I think for me, really, I just had more basic questions than themes. Like,
Do you want me to do the last theme, then we can do questions?
sure. They're not major, so we can. We're running long on time, so we can kind of omit it.
We can do as many as you think are good, and then you can cut off.
Okay.
So, with Rebellion, I think the film does a great job of showing how rebellion works and why it's dangerous, but why it's also necessary. The authoritarianism makes rebellion inevitable. It is the cruelty of Richard and the parents and their domineering that makes the children resent them and reject ultimately their worldview. And it's what brings the children together when they don't really empathize with each other because they're linked together by their hate. And I think that demonstrates like why authoritarianism in the long term is so not just ethically wrong, it's strategically wrong. And you know, the children aren't able to rebel independently. Like Bender's great at disrupting things, but he's a fucking idiot. He has no plan and he's deeply unorganized and everyone hates him. He needs the other children in order to actually functionally rebel. Otherwise, he's just like spazzing out in the corner, ripping up library books. You know, Andrew is the person who has leadership skills. He pulls the group together and makes them actually work together. Allison's self-awareness is essential for breaking through those stereotypes. Brian is the one who actually has the writing skills to write up the fuck you essay at the end. And Claire is the cunning one. She's the perceptive one who helps hide a lot of the evidence and protect Bender. Like they're all necessary. And it's why authoritarians separate the public, is they understand real rebellion can't be done by just the wild and out ones. It has to be collaborative across many different groups of people.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting to showcase how rebellion is different across different sort of subgroups, right? Of different people
Yeah.
and having those different strategies. Um, so there were like a couple questions I had. Um, we can talk about them briefly. I guess it like one of the things I talked about was like what does it mean to be young and trying to figure out and find yourself, and I think this film encapsulates that to a T. Like about like specifically trying to broaden your view. And I guess that's what also leads me into the next question, which is like how to embrace diversity, right? And I
Yeah,
guess
I
like,
think a lot of that is just being independently minded. Don't
yeah,
trust what the parents tell you. Go look for yourself, you know?
yeah, and I guess like the other thing I thought like that related to all these sort of questions is like how do parents in society teach us to act within our roles, right? And I guess that
Mhm.
the film showcases in this sense that um, parents are kind of the thing that will showcase you not only the rights but the wrongs, right? Like they will steer you down the right path in some respects, but also steer you down the wrong path in very different respects. So,
I also think it's important to notice that the way the children rebel from their parents is what their parents taught them.
yeah.
Like Andrew's strength was given to him by his father.
Hmm.
Claire's manipulativeness was given to her by her mother. Brian's like writing skills were shaped by that academic emphasis. It's the same with the other children. Like they didn't rebel by rejecting everything their parents gave them. They rebelled by using the things their parents gave them in order to chart their own path.
So, I guess we're coming to like is there anything else theme wise you want to talk about before we sort of start to wrap up here?
I think we can just rate it if you don't have
Okay.
anything to say beyond
Yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah. So I guess for me, this is very, very high on my list. Um,
Mm.
I give it a 9.5. on my 10-point scale.
Interesting. I actually didn't like this film the first time I watched it when I was in high school because I just found the stereotypes not very interesting. I didn't see the underlying meaning. I didn't appreciate the writing.
Yeah.
I would say, yeah, I agree with you. I have a harsher scale than you, but I would put this as a 9.
Yeah. But yeah, I will say, like, definitely well worth the watch. I'm glad we watched it together. I'm glad we were finally able to shoot another episode together after a couple weeks. But yeah, that's everything. Any final thoughts before we sign off here?
Rebellions are always good, and you should always antagonize your teacher and tell them to go fuck themselves.
Probably not the advice you should leave people with, but good note there, Fowler.
Embrace anarchy and chaos. Never follow the rules.
This is probably the good time to bounce off here. So we're so thank you guys so much for watching. Subscribe for some more film oriented podcasts, and we'll talk to you very soon. Have a good rest of your day. Bye.